When Dwayne offered up this opportunity to speak to you guys, he did give me some words of wisdom. And his advice was really to make the presentation interesting. He also suggested I present about standards. It's not the most exciting of topics at the best of times, but I will tell you one thing, you are a captive audience. There is food being served outside, it smells really good. I will do my best to make these 30 minutes go as quick as they can, and I'll try and make it as interesting as I can as well. So a little bit about myself. My name is Osama, please call me Oz. I have a day job at Caterpillar. I cover product safety and compliance for the Australasia region. But I'll point your attention to the two hats on the right. Those are the ones that I'm actually wearing today. I'm here representing an organization called CMEG and another organization called Standards Australia, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. So CMEG is the Australian Construction and Mining Equipment Industry Group. It's the peak body for the manufacturers of the types of equipment that you see on the screen. Pretty large organization, very active in standards development, etc. And it's really funded by the OEMs to cover industry issues that are relevant to CMEG. So like the Mechanical Engineering Safety Seminar is a safe space for certain types of engineers, clearly not mining engineers or electrical engineers. In CMEG, there is a safe space for engineers too. It's called the Engineering Working Group. And the intent of this group is really to offer up someone from each OEM as tribute, and we collectively discuss industry issues that are relevant to us collectively, and then provide advice. This is the point where I tell you the whole purpose of my presentation. If you have your phone in front of you, if you have time later, go to www.cmeig.com.au, click on Working Groups, Engineering. There's some great information there, and it's been written by people that couldn't sell ice to Eskimos. It's written by engineers for this community. There's some great information. Some of you might have already used it. So CMEG is one of the 20 nominating organizations that participate in writing Australian standards in Standards Australia for earth-moving machines. And that's done under the banner of this technical committee called ME63, Earth-Moving Equipment. And you'll see some logos you probably recognize. It's industry associations, it's regulatory bodies, it's large sort of associations that deal with specific topics that come together to write these standards that you use. And that whole ME63 organization in Australia feeds up into an international committee called ISO TC 127, Technical Committee 127, that deals with the same topic. The only difference, obviously, is Australia is one of 43 voices from around the world that feed into the writing of these international standards. There's 185 or 184 standards in that portfolio. I think there's 15 that are currently actively being worked on. And really, there's a lot of great work being done. But I'm gonna move us back to Australia for a sec. Hands up if you're familiar with AS 5327, Earth Moving Machinery Access Systems. Oh, good, I'm seeing a few hands. Great. So this is a standard that deals with steps, platforms, walkways, basically anything that you would touch and feel and work your way through as you got from the operator cab or a maintenance area to off the machine. I presented in 2019 on this topic, and I would characterize it as before that time, we had 5 sources of guidance that were being used. There was a fixed plant standard, there was an old Australian standard, there was some guidance from EMERS, there was some international standards. And the problem you have is if you have a lot of standards that are written by different groups of experts that have come together, they're going to have technical differences. And you're going to have a lot of trouble determining what is reasonably practicable, what is the benchmark, because they're just fundamentally different because of where they've come about. So the intent of AS 5327 was to take all that guidance, put it together in one document so that you have one safe source that you can go to and go, hey, this is the industry consensus position for what you need to do for access systems on machines. So we took that approach from 2019 with AS 5327 and then leveraged it across the whole portfolio of standards we had. At the time, we had 60 standards. I think the oldest one was from 1982, and the newest one was from 2006. So quite a dated portfolio. And so what we did was we took that portfolio of standards and we put them into 3 baskets. One of them was, what is the international best practice standard? Do we have any objections to it? If not, let's adopt it as an Australian standard as is. And we've done that with 154 of them so far. We had the second basket where, hey, we have genuine reasons for having perhaps a higher standard of bar or a different standard of bar because of the way we do things here. So they fell into this modified standard category. And then we have this final category where there really is no other international standard out there that we're aware of. And so we're going to maintain those as Australian standards. So there's probably this question coming up now about why would you do this? What's the benefit of harmonization? It may be obvious to some, but I'll kind of cover it anyway. Really, it's about clarity and consistency. You want to know what the benchmark is. Standards are your safe source, right? There is also a benefit here to look at if there's an international community writing these standards. And the reality is, mining is big in Australia, but if you look at the broader earth-moving machinery sector, we're a very small piece of the international market, and we don't really have any manufacturers here. So there's an element of trying to not boil the ocean and focus on what are the things that we think are important, why are they important, let's make that clear. But for everything else, let's make this as clear and concise as possible. Participating internationally, having the same portfolio of standards with modifications or without, also opens up this opportunity that, well, now we can take Australian experts and they can actually participate directly in the international standard that's being developed. The final comment, and Cameron kind of touched on this in his intro, Robin touched on it, machines are getting a lot more complex. They really are. Machines, earth-moving machines are just like your cars. They are computers on wheels or tracks. They might have 20 computers on board. They might have a couple hundred sensors. There's a lot of software that is really driving that machine. If you're going to take a machine and you're going to put, Robin, you mentioned e-stops, so I'll use that as an example. What do you want that e-stop to do? Australia is the only country that puts e-stops on machines. It's relatively easy to do when your answer is turn off the engine. When your answer is going to be, you have an engine, you have a battery pack, you have some other functions, you have telemetry, what do you want it to do? This is going to become very complex unless we have a standard format to use. I will mention that there are going to be some things that we're not going to standardize, and hopefully you can see from the example, the white charger is your toothbrush charger if you're in the Oral-B camp. There's reasons why that's not a Type-C charger related to wet spaces, and there's a standard for that too. One of the subtle benefits that certainly I didn't see come up, but it was mentioned by Anthony Logan and Pat Hurley from Resources Safety and Health Queensland. A lot of you only had subscriptions through, say, SAI Global to Australian standards. And so you never actually had subscriptions to see any of these 184 international standards that were out there. By turning those into Australian standards, for the first time, you can actually have the same portfolio of standards that is being used everywhere else in the world. And you can access that without having to spend, 170, 180 bucks per standard document. So where to next? Now, this is the next cab of the rank for ME63. It's been something we've been working on as a committee for probably the last couple of years, but it's getting to the pointy end. AS20474, Earth-Moving Machinery Safety. It's a series of standards, and I'll come back to that in a sec, but essentially in Europe, there is a standard series called EN474. You meet that standard, that's a regulatory requirement. You put a CE mark on your machine, and that indicates that, hey, you meet the legislative obligations in Europe. That standard was converted into an ISO standard, ISO 20474, in about 2016 kind of timeframe was the last revision. And we've started working on our own version of that, which is AS2474. There's a part 1, it's general safety requirements, and then there's 13 other parts. And if anybody wants to ask the question, why do the numbers go to 15, but there's only 14, I'll look forward to that question. But part 1, think of it like your overarching, every earth-moving machine needs to have these things. So it'll have a section on seats, it'll have a section on vibration, on noise, on ROPS, brakes, steering, and it'll In a lot of cases, it'll say, these are some requirements, and then it'll say, go read AS 3450 for brakes, or go read 5010 for steering, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have parts 2 to 15, and they would be specific requirements for specific types of machines. So 2 is dozers, 3 is loaders, 6 is trucks, et cetera, et cetera. The direction we've gone in ME63 is that part 1 is going to have some modifications. There are some things where Australia is different and it's not covered in the ISO standard, and so we're going to address those in that Australian modification. For the other 13 parts, they are going to be direct text adoptions. And here's sort of some of the key modifications that you'll see shortly when this comes out for public comment. There is some guidance around e-stops and shutdown switches. It might not be true for New South Wales mines, but certainly rest of Australia and non-mining. If you have a e-stop on your machine, you press a button, it may well do nothing, right? Because it may not have any monitoring. There's a whole argument around, is that acceptable or not? Is it intended to replicate an existing machine control, or is it just another tool that you can check manually over time and accept a certain level of doesn't work every time? So the standard does have some language around that. It has some language around double pole and single pole isolators and when is which appropriate. It has some guidance around some of the conversation you heard earlier today about the leading cause of injury and fatality on earth-moving machines globally is still people not wearing a seatbelt. So things to encourage the wearing of seatbelts, things to monitor when somebody leaves a seat and the machine hasn't been put into a park position or an interlock is applied. So it'll have some guidance on that, but I'll kind of leave it at this note. It's going to come out for public comment probably a couple of months from now, so look out for it. If you don't have a notification, go to Standards Australia's website and you can subscribe to notifications from Standards Australia and you will see when standards come out for public comment. There's some other work that's ongoing. There is a 2-part project related to tires and rims that is in development. There's a part 1 which deals with rims. That is at the final publishing stage and should come out in the next month. There is a part 2 which deals with tires that is currently at public comment. So it's a public comment for another week and a bit. Feel free to log on, have a look at it, and make comments. We'd very much welcome those. But really, if I summarize the big changes in these standards, part 1 is focusing a little bit more on making sure you don't mix and match components on split rims, so you don't put the wrong lock ring on a machine. It's also got some guidance around the fitment of things like, I'll use the trade name SureLock and other such devices that either retain the lock ring or prevent inflation if it's not correctly seated. There's a couple other projects, one related to guarding that should publish in the next month. And there's another one for lifting with excavators and how you determine that change in stability limits depending on if you're across the tracks or over the tracks, if your boom and stick are all the way out, et cetera, et cetera. There are also a large number of international standards that are in development at the moment. There's 15. I've covered sort of the ones that I think this group is going to be most interested in. The first one is ISO 13649, which deals with fire prevention. This should publish by the end of this year. It'll look very familiar to you because it has a lot of the language that's in AS 5062 around design that's been captured into this international standard. And think of it as complementary. The intent is that this is going to help the designer of your machine with, hey, here's the 20 things you need to think about that are seen at the end point of a machine catching on fire. And there's not going to be surprises. A lot of it is hose maintenance, but it's also how do you design to make it easier to do that? How do you make it easier to design so that it's easier to reroute hoses the same way that it was done at the factory after its first big change-up? There's a standard going on about cabin glass, and I'll cover this in a little bit more detail later on. There's some work being done around functional safety standards to make them aligned for use in Europe. There's also a new standard underway to deal with how do you do functional safety for non-determinate control systems. So this is when you are essentially using AI or some sort of probabilistic algorithm. Think of autonomy programs. You can't really use traditional functional safety standards as they stand, so there's a project to try and work on that. There's also some work being done around collision avoidance. There's basic collision avoidance. Think of it like put it in reverse, doesn't move if it detects an object. This part 4 that's in development is around swing frames, so think excavators mainly. How do you deal with rotational collision avoidance zones, and how do you deal with track machines? There's also a project that has come about from, now that we're starting to see battery electric machines, you kind of have this issue of they don't make a lot of noise. You might hear some pump noise, you might hear some gear train noise, but it's sporadic. It's not a consistent noise like Dave's intro was an hour ago. So you have this issue of, now that you can't tell by looking at a machine what it's doing, you need a way to indicate to a bystander what hazards might be present that they're not aware of. So yeah, that's an interesting project that's in development as well. There's some work being done around telematics. How do machines talk to each other? How does system A from one OEM talk to system B from a different OEM? There's work around electrification, and most of that at the moment has been exploratory. You have this large portfolio of standards. How do you apply those standards to an electrified powertrain? And it's uncovering some interesting things, like there's an hour meter standard. And it's completely redundant for a battery electric machine, because and hour meters are used for service, for warranty, for used machines, and it's like, well, all of a sudden, how do you determine hours of usage when you have a battery electric platform or a hybrid platform versus what we're used to seeing? And there's also some work being done around autonomy where there's a bit more maturity in the sector, and we're at the point where it's time to start defining different levels of autonomy. Like you have in cars, you have level 0 to level 5, similar kind of taxonomy for earth-moving machines. So this is the point where you go, tell me more about standards. It's so exciting. So, in your commercial statements, you always have these forward-looking statements. It kind of says, treat this as just an opinion about how things are going to be in the future. And I've got just a few slides to do that for you here. These are things that are being discussed in the standards world, either in Australia or internationally. They're not ready for prime time. They're not at a position that you're going to see a published standard this year or next year. But I wanted to give you some insights. The first is around glass, and some of you might have done glass testing to AS2080. It's like a 300 mil by 300 mil box. You drop a 2.2 kilo ball from 4 meters. Some people have changed that to 9 meters. So you end up with like about 200 joules of impact energy. There's some work being done internationally to look at plastics, so polycarbonate windows rather than your conventional laminate or tempered glass. And we're talking about 2,000 joules instead of 200 joules. You get to this point where you'd kind of have to drop it from quite a big height and change the mass and shape of the ball. Instead, you could go down the Mythbusters route and get an air cannon and shoot a projectile horizontally. And so there's been some industry-funded research to do that in Australia, but looking more at the laminated glass rather than the polycarbonates. If you want a pecking order, tempered glass capability is about down here, laminated's probably somewhere here, and then polycarbonates are beyond that. So I hope this video plays. See that? That's about 2,000 joules going through a chronograph into a vertical assembly with a 300 mil by 300 mil glass sample. The blue frame you see moving away from you at slow-mo speeds has a witness card that's meant to reflect the human body a certain distance behind the glass on the inside of the cab. The issue that we're seeing, and I'm kind of spoiler alert for a report that'll come out in the next few months, it's not so much the thickness of the glass that matters. It's actually more the thickness of the laminate layer, because that's what holds it together. The issue you have is if you have glass sandwiched with laminate and glass, you'll stop the projectile, but the spalling out the back end will do some serious damage still. So short term, what's the answer? More work required, but the answer may be something like you need a tint film on the inside of your cab. There's some practical issues with how easy is it to apply those, how robust are they, do they haze? But that's the direction it's going. Basically, the thicker the laminate, the better the performance. I've been working around standards for about 15 years, and it's quite an interesting time to be in this space. I was going to say dynamic, but saying it's a dynamic time and standards in the same sentence just doesn't work. But there's a lot of existing standards work. Like Robin pointed out, there's a lot of things like there's visibility standards, there's braking standards that are being looked at. But then there's all these emerging topics that are kind of your step change items. They're fundamental differences to how you operate machines, and so the standards that are written around that. Starting to see some of those step change topics come up. There's also, because we're entering a new era, you have safety standards which come more from a maturity, and then now you have performance standards because it's such a new area and you actually have to write those again. The old version of performance standards would be things like, how do you measure volume in a bucket? We're kind of getting to, how do you measure fuel efficiency or energy efficiency for a machine? Those kinds of standards are coming back into the forefront. You would have seen from the active projects, telematics, autonomy, collision avoidance, they're all technology related because that's what's really being added to machines. That's where the standards are being written. I think the number is about 1,600 now, autonomous and semi-autonomous machines in Australia. So definitely in the mainstream now. There's a lot of talk about, well, how do you manage that interoperability? And there's a lot of talk about AI. Some of it is flavor of the month. I'm just giving you my opinion. You remember Clippy back with Word and Excel back in the 90s? Yeah, I mean, Clippy was AI basically. The talk now is about large language models and generative AI. That's really what's different. And that's really a data conversation. So what you're going to see, I think, is a lot of interest in who owns the data, how do you use the data, how can you use the data, and you'll see these standards work around that. There's also a lot of talk about sustainability and kind of emerging technologies for energy transfer is one of those areas, but there's also things like chemical management. There's a big desire to track and trace to a component and a subcomponent level, down to what mine did you source this material from that you put into your solder that was on your circuit board that went into another supplier to another supplier onto a machine. That is a lot of work, but it is something that's being worked on as well. Okay, now I have to change this slide up a little. Education and training is a big piece at the moment because to some degree we're having a big generation shift. I'm Gen Y. I'm sure there's Gen X's in the room, Gen Z's in the room. Does anybody know what comes after Gen Z? This will make you feel old, but it's one of those cases of when you run out of an alphabet and you have to start again, Gen Alpha. I've got a couple of Gen Alphas at home, an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old. Gen Alphas will be on your mine sites in 3 years. And they're different. You know, Xbox controllers for them, changing modes on Xbox controllers, they're very good at that. They're not so good at some of the things that we grew up seeing. They wouldn't have any reference for them. We were watching a live stream of the Olympics, and my daughter had to run out because she needed to go to the bathroom. And she came back and she's like, "Oh, can you just load a different stream and can you pause it?" And it's just like, "Hey, this is live." It's a foreign concept to them. And you might say, "Well, there's sports." It's like, well, their sports is different. They're interested in esports. They're interested in drone racing league. The superstars that we consider superstars are different for them. Examples out of our realm, but there are examples on how do you design an interface for a machine. We're used to controls. Like you think of graders with levers and, moving the stick was a big deal. They're much more comfortable with a gamepad as a controller than we're ever going to be. I was going to bag out that in the Olympics, now they have crazy things like skateboarding and breakdancing, but I mean, we won the skateboarding, so that's all good now. We're going to have that. Another interesting thing that we haven't had for a while is geopolitics. This is from Associated Press. Some of these have already happened, but half the world's population are having elections in this 12-month period. And that can make a very big difference. UK Brexit was a great example. They kind of went, we're going to do everything on our own. But funnily enough, they've realized that it was a bigger issue than they thought it was going to be. And so now they're kind of like, actually, we want to use some of the things from Europe still. Just we won't talk about it. But then you have things that are going the other way where standards and harmonization was happening, but now it's kind of moving in a different direction again, where people are going, hey, I'm going to put myself first. So it's an interesting dynamic, and it has an impact on standards development as well. So I'm really at the end here. Where to from here? And really, it's what I mentioned earlier. www.cmeig.com.au, working groups, engineering. A lot of the topics I've talked about are covered on this webpage. It's all publicly available. You're highly encouraged to go and use it. There's position papers, there's lists of standards, there are equivalencies between Australian and international, and it's something that's constantly live and gets updated on a regular basis. So I'd very much encourage you to go have a look. Good.
Thanks, Osama. I'll get the presenters to come to the stage again for questions. Now, we've got a question from Slido, but I'll ask if there are questions on the floor, if you could wait for a microphone to come to you so that the rest of the room can hear, and also it gives some context for the recording.